God of War Ragnarok is now available for everyone to enjoy, at least if you're playing on a PlayStation 4, PlayStation 4 Pro, or PlayStation 5, because this game is indeed still cross-generation like many other big Sony releases this year. But unlike the likes of, say, Horizon the Forbidden West, the differences here are a little more on the subtle side, which is actually good news for owners of the last generation machines. I spent last week examining the game on PS5, however, but since then, Oliver has been busy checking out the last gen versions, and he's here to discuss it with me today.
Hi John, how's it going?
It is going wonderful. We're still playing God of War, and there's a lot to talk about here. And I think the thing to start with really is the quality of the experience across all consoles and how cross-gen sort of plays into this specific release, right? Because I think you found that God of War Ragnarok is pretty darn good on every platform, right?
Yeah, it's great across current gen and last gen consoles. The thing that really stuck out playing it on the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 4 Pro is that the overall visual design looks very coherent on those consoles. And not to spoil too much, but there's no real image quality compromises relative to God of War 2018. So it definitely feels like a game that's built for those consoles and their additions for PlayStation 5, as opposed to a game that sort of is a little bit compromised in last gen consoles to accommodate a little bit of a more ambitious aesthetic.
Yeah, and I think that's fair to say. And actually last week I did have a chance to speak with Sony Santa Monica themselves, with several of the key members on the staff, and that gave me a little more insight into what they were trying to build here. They did say they had access to the PlayStation 5 development kits very early on, but the goal here, as they've said before, really was to create something that was specifically designed to give PlayStation 4 owners a great experience and an end to the whole Nordic saga that they've built here. And to that end, what makes this game more difficult to create from a cross-gen perspective versus, say, Horizon is in fact the lack of procedurally generated content, right? The Forbidden West is a game that relies heavily on procedural generation to sort of add detail to the world. It's possible to sort of bring up those details relatively easily and take advantage of the extra power of the new system, where God of War Ragnarok is extremely artist-driven. Every single aspect of every scene is carefully handcrafted and placed. There isn't really none of that going on, and as a result, they can't rely on the more programmatic solutions for enhancing the game. It all has to be done very carefully. That also means they can't just go nuts with detail, because they have to ensure it runs smoothly across all platforms. And I think, as we've found here, most of the differences are impactful on PS5. Like I said in the first video, it feels almost like an enhanced PC version of the game, but at a glance, it doesn't actually look that different, right?
Yeah, most of the differences are pretty subtle, and honestly, you'd only really notice them in side-by-side comparisons. I think you would notice it, let's say, if the PlayStation 5 was running at 4K with the PlayStation 4's level of visual quality. A lot of the settings are kind of tuned, I think, for higher resolution and higher precision outputs, and you won't really notice the differences otherwise.
Precisely. So let's run down through some of those. So one of the main things that they wanted to tackle when developing this new game was to essentially solve the light leaking issues, right? When you bake out indirect lighting, especially in these games, getting the level of precision and resolution, and also things like ambient occlusion, to really deliver the most coherent, consistent image, that does take a little more power. And this is actually an area where they did take advantage of PlayStation 5, right?
Across God of War Ragnarok, the indirect lighting quality, I would say, is very high, but there are some issues that you'll see at times, in particular on dynamic objects. So in like Kratos, when you're in a shadowed scene, sometimes you'll see a little bit of that specular kind of edge lighting. And you'll also notice it in certain areas, certain environmental assets that have really bright specular that doesn't really fit in with the rest of the scene. On PlayStation 4, that is, because for the most part, these are basically addressed on PlayStation 5. You have an ambient occlusion pass that properly occludes more of that kind of odd-looking specular.
So that's actually one of the big key differences here, is they are using SSDO, or screen space directional occlusion, on PS5 that is not used on the PS4 version. This was first featured in God of War on the PC, actually, which they told me they didn't have very much involvement with. That really was a port created by that porting studio. But they were developing SSDO for this game for PS5, and you can definitely see it here in action, and that really helps ground characters and dynamic objects within the scene much better, I think, right?
Yeah.
And beyond that, the shadow quality, I'd say, is significantly upgraded, especially in quality mode where you get contact hardening.
Yeah, on PlayStation 5 in the resolution mode, you do get higher quality shadow maps, and they also do have contact hardening, so you get that sense of variable penumbra as the shadow falls away from the source. But even on the PlayStation 5 in performance mode, you still see some improvement to shadow quality relative to PlayStation 4 consoles.
But I would say, even still, obviously those are expected cutbacks, but I would say that the shadows in general are perfectly serviceable on the older machines, right? And it looks quite good, especially on the base PS4 where the resolution is capped at, 1080p. And, we'll talk more about that shortly, but it does work pretty well overall, I'd say. But of course, PS5 also gains additional lighting. For cinematic cutscenes especially, the artists were, I'm told, given the opportunity to essentially add more lights to the scenes. And you can see that even right from the very beginning, right?
Yeah, there are quite a few cutscenes where, again, you might not notice this if you're just playing through them on one platform or another platform. But when you kind of flip back and forth, you will notice that there actually is an additional light on, say, Kratos or Atreus, or there is a little bit of additional lighting in the background, perhaps. So there are changes there. You wouldn't necessarily notice them without a side-by-side comparison, but I think they do add some depth to quite a few scenes.
Yeah, and it's not quite like, you remember all the hubbub around Horizon, right, with the hero lighting?
It's not hero lighting.
No, they did not. They did not take that approach. It's actually very subtle, but it's effective, and it really looks good. That combined with the shadow stuff, especially on character close-ups, where you now get fine shadows like on their nose and eyes and clothing, and everything sort of shadows much more consistently. You don't really get that on PS4. Also, things like screen space reflections, I think, were improved, as well as the cube maps, especially in quality mode, where they use that sort of like light ray tracing feature on PS5 and quality mode to better figure out the positioning of cube maps relative to the scenery. And they also use that as a source for color information. Obviously, this is not available in the PS4 version.
Yeah, the cube map alignment in the PS5 in the higher quality mode, the alignment between the screen space reflections and the cube maps is definitely quite a bit better than it is on the other console versions and on the other PS5 mode. And the screen space reflections are also improved quite a bit on the PlayStation 5 in that resolution mode in particular, where they do draw out the screen space reflections quite a bit closer to the camera. They are higher quality. Going back to the PS4, I think part of this is probably a function of resolution. The screen space reflections are probably one of the bigger image quality faults within the game because they do tend to speck a little bit. They mostly still do look good, but when you step up to the higher resolution, higher performance platforms, they do tend to resolve quite a bit more cleanly.
Those are kind of the general improvements, I would say. I mean, there are some differences to like depth of field and motion blur, so according to Santa Monica, the depth of field and motion blur paths are actually connected. They're tied together in every mode except resolution mode on PS5, where they separate them out. But as I noted in my other video, they sort of scaled based on frame rate and resolution. So depth of field appears shallower at a lower resolution, and motion blur shutter speed, you get sort of a longer trail when at a lower frame rate. But it really seemed weird that PS4, the base PS4 actually seemed to have the highest quality motion blur, at least in terms of shutter speed settings.
Yeah, I don't know what it would look like in terms of sample count, but in terms of the actual fluidity of the motion when you're playing, the PlayStation 4 at 30 FPS feels substantially smoother to me than any other 30 FPS mode across the consoles, just because it seems to have a little bit of a longer simulated shutter speed, which is probably a function of that lower resolution. So you do actually get an experience that feels, for whatever reason, palpably smoother than the other console versions in general. Not to jump the gun, but because of that enhanced motion blur.
That actually surprised me about the footage you sent me of the base PS4. I was like, wow, that actually looks really... it somehow looks really smooth.
Yeah.
That was an unexpected twist, I will say. Let's shift gears a little bit and quickly cover the resolution stuff. So they actually revealed all the resolutions themselves, which is that's actually great, open and honest for a developer to just come out and say, here's what our game is running at. The first big thing though is that checkerboard rendering is gone, right? Like that was a key aspect of rendering on PlayStation 4 Professional in God of War 2018, and they have removed that and replaced it with a TAAU solution. And TAA in general, I think, is a very good solution in this case, and helps clean up the visuals a lot compared to the last game, even at lower resolutions such as 1080p. But why don't you quickly cover then, what do the various PS4 systems produce in terms of resolution numbers?
Yeah, so starting with the base console, the PS4 seems to be running at 1080p flat with no signs of dynamic resolution, either according to Sony Santa Monica or my own pixel count. So it's just
Yeah, that's what they said.
yeah,
Exactly.
it's just a straight 1080p, which is, again, it's the same setup as God of War 2018. And then stepping over to the PlayStation 4 Pro, the PS4 Professional, there are two modes on that console. So the resolution mode goes between 1440p and 1656p. 1656p seemed to be the most common resolution in my testing, and that is combined with TAAU, so in stills it actually looks pretty close to PS5 in image clarity, which is pretty nice. Looks reasonably 4K-like. For the PS4 Professional in performance mode, Sony Santa Monica says it goes between 1080p and 1656p, but in practice it seems to almost always be 1080p internally. The highest res I got out of it was 1152p. I'm sure it does go higher than that in very select circumstances, but even when looking at the sky, it was pretty limited.
Which is consistent with the last game as well, which the performance mode did drop the resolution, if I recall. So
yeah.
That's not unexpected. What's interesting though is that and I haven't tested this in terms of pixel counting, but if you install the PS4 version of the game on a PS5, it behaves a lot like God of War 2018 does on a PS5, where it actually locks you out of the quality mode settings and instead just runs in the performance mode. And it seems to be at the higher resolution. It just runs at 60 basically. And I thought it was rather curious that they actually included what seems like a PS5 specific detection mode when using the PS4 native version on a PS5. Like, okay, yeah. I mean, I guess if you bought the PS4 disc, and I don't know, it's really weird that they did that, but it is an option.
I've definitely heard stories of people accidentally installing, well, we do it intentionally all the time at Digital Foundry, but accidentally installing the PS4 code on their PS5. So,
exactly.
So if they're in that boat, at least it would be a little bit of a better experience for that person.
Yeah, exactly. Then obviously the other aspect to all of this is going to be the frame rate, and based on your numbers here, I actually did test the PS4 Pro and it seemed great, but it does also seem to be relatively boring outside of the performance mode on Pro in terms of actual discussion point, right? Like,
yeah,
base PS4 seems to be mostly just a stable 30 with tiny little dips here and there. Like, how much did you actually find there?
On PS4, there was one cutscene near the beginning of the game, and there's like one clutch of drop frames where it maybe dropped 5 or 6 frames. It's not a big deal. You will maybe notice it, but it's very brief. And then I also found, when I was paddling around in the Dwarven area, once I managed to kind of drop a small clutch of frames over a few seconds. Outside of that, it was a perfect 30, so very consistent there. The Professional has 2 modes, as previously mentioned. So you have that resolution mode, and in resolution mode, it does seem to be basically a perfect 30. Couldn't get it to drop at all during gameplay, during cutscenes. Tried what I could. I could not get it to drop at all. So I think that is basically a locked 30 FPS for all intents and purposes. But then there's the performance mode. It tends to average around 40 to 55 FPS. It's very unstable. At the lowest I saw was about 35 FPS. And in rare instances, if you're looking right up at a blue sky, you might even spot 60. But it's pretty unstable and definitely not a great way to play. If the PS4 Pro had VRR, it might be quite good, but
yeah.
This
was true of God of War 2018 as well. The performance mode, I mean, I know some people do enjoy it, but I honestly couldn't stand it. It just feels extremely juddery. It obviously reduces image quality as well. It's not great for normal gameplay. So yeah, I'm with you on that. One other aspect of loading though to quickly mention then is actually the loading times, which I kind of touched on in my video, where PS5, if you load a save, It's around 10 seconds or so.
Yeah.
And it takes about 30 something on PS4 Pro in my experience. Sony Santa Monica actually, they told me that they completely rewrote the entire loading system specifically to take advantage of the new hardware. The knock-on effect of that is that it also benefits the PS4 version. So even though they're running from a mechanical drive, it does actually improve loading times there versus the last game. But if you're just playing straight through this game, you're not going to see many loading screens outside of those upon death.
Yeah.
Did you actually test that, by the way? How much are you waiting if you die and then have to reload a scene?
So I did test that, and it comes in at about 12 seconds or so on
So not
PS4.
too bad.
Not too bad. And that initial load is, about 30 to 40 seconds. But if you're playing reasonably well, the whole game is unbroken. There's no loading times effectively. So,
The loading is like if you're not using sleep mode, essentially, or you start another game on your PS4, then you have to load the save, and it's going to take that amount of time. But by and large, looking at this kind of situation here, it's definitely a case, kind of as I suggested before, where clearly this is a game built for PlayStation 4, and the experience is really good on PlayStation 4. And the PS5 version is more of an enhancement on that rather than the reverse, right? This is not a case of building for PS5 first and then downscaling. And you can definitely tell. But, it's difficult to argue with the results. Like, this is clearly what they were making. The quality of the assets and the animation work, camera work, everything is just phenomenally high quality. The performance is great across all platforms. And it's just such a polished, mostly bug-free experience, which is something we don't see as often these days, especially with games becoming more complex. So given that, it's pretty darn impressive.
Yeah, it's super polished, really nicely put together. And the graphics, even though there aren't huge upgrades on PlayStation 5, the game still looks really beautiful. Like some of the art, some of the assets, and the indirect lighting, it all comes together. It looks so beautiful sometimes. Really, really nice.
It really does.
And I think what you said in your video about the game sort of feeling a little bit like a PC version on PS5, to me that really rings quite true, because all of the changes, all the improvements that you might get on the very highest end platform this is currently on, they're all very additive. You don't really need them from a visual quality perspective. It is really nice to play the game at 60 FPS and above on PlayStation 5, I will grant that. But in terms of the basic visual design, everything is there on PlayStation 4. You are not missing out on much there, if that is the platform that you have access to. And really on all last-gen consoles, it's a very solid, great playing, great feeling, great looking experience. So I'm definitely very pleased with the turnout on PS4 and PS4 Pro.
Yeah, that's good. And I think that's good for everyone that wants to play the game. And I think that's pretty much all we have for today. So thanks for all your findings on this one, Oliver. It looks like PS4 owners are going to be in for quite a treat with God of War Ragnarok. And I guess I'll be curious to see where the studio goes next. But obviously, given how long it takes to make these games, we probably won't see that for many years to come at this point. And by then, who knows? Maybe we'll have a PS5 Pro, maybe the PS6 will be on the horizon, and the next game will also be a cross-gen release. It's difficult to say, but that's kind of where we are. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and found it useful. And of course, thanks for joining me, Oliver.
Likewise, thanks, John.
And of course, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, subscribe, ring that notification bell, all that good stuff, and we will see you next time.